Scientists, called paleontologists, look for fossils in the ground. One day, scientists discovered two new kinds of fossils that they had never seen before. The fossils were of animals that lived long ago, before humans existed. By looking at these fossils, the scientists could see that the two fossils were quite different from each other. So the scientists decided they were two different species and gave them two different names, Harpies and Juramayas. Using their knowledge of lots of animals, the scientists were able to make a guess about what these fossil species looked like. The scientists thought they looked very different from each other. The Harpies probably looked like lizards, and the Juramayas probably looked like rats. But when the scientists looked really closely at the Harpy and Juramaya fossils, they noticed they were also similar to each other in important ways. They both had a long spine that had 27 bones. They also both had 4 legs, with 12 bones in each foot. And they both had sharp, pointy teeth. These similarities between the fossils helped the scientists figure out that the Harpies and the Juramayas were related to each other, even though they were different species and looked very different. How could this be? How could two groups of animals as different as the Harpies and the Juramayas be related? Scientists looked at all the fossils that they dug up from the different layers of rock, and they figured out how this happened. Let's keep reading to find out what they think happened. Let's find out how the Juramayas evolved from the Harpies over millions of years. The story begins with the Harpies. Millions of years ago, Harpies lived in the shallow water near the shore. They could climb onto the land, but they spent most of their time in the water looking for fish to eat. Most Harpies had wider tails, shorter legs, and smaller claws. Harpies with these traits were better able to swim and catch fish in the water, so they were the healthiest and had the most offspring. Even though most of the Harpies looked very alike, there were still some little differences between them. Although many Harpies had wider tails, some had skinnier tails. Although many had shorter legs, some had longer legs. Although many had smaller claws, some had bigger claws. Like us, each Harpy had a different mix of traits. Each Harpy was unique. One day, while the Harpies, with all their different traits, were swimming in the water, a large underwater volcano erupted. Lava gushed out of the volcano and created a new mountain. This new mountain separated the Harpies into two groups. One group in the water and one group that was trapped on land. What happened to the Harpies that got stranded on the land? This new habitat was very different from the water where the animals used to live. Luckily, the animals could find fish to eat in the shallow pond in the forest, so they were not hungry. But life on land was dangerous. Predators hunted the Harpies that were stranded there, and the Harpies could not escape in the water anymore. But Harpies that could climb high into the trees were able to escape from the predators. Because most of the Harpies had wider tails, shorter legs, and smaller claws, it was hard for most Harpies to climb the trees. The heavy, wide tails and shorter legs slowed the Harpies down, and the smaller claws made it harder to hold on to the trees. These Harpies could only reach the low branches or could not climb the trees at all. it was easier for the predators to catch them. There were a few harpies with skinnier tails, longer legs, and bigger claws. They were better at climbing the trees. They were such good climbers, they were able to quickly climb all the way to the highest branches, where the predators could not reach them. The harpies with traits that meant that they were very slow climbers were caught by the predators before they had any offspring. The harpies with traits that meant they were a little bit slow were only able to survive long enough to have one offspring before the predators caught them. However, the small number of harpies with traits that made it easier to climb quickly lived a long time and had many offspring. Harpy offspring tended to look like their parents, so harpies that had many traits that made it easier to climb tended to have offspring with many traits that made it easier to climb. The harpies that were able to stay alive long enough to have offspring when they first arrived in the forest got old and died. With the offspring grown up and their parents gone, the group of harpies looked different than it had in the past. And this is why the group of harpies in the forest and the group of harpies that were back in the water began to look different from one another. In the water, harpies with traits that made it easier to swim had survived the longest. But in the forest, harpies with traits that made it easier to climb had survived the longest. This is why more offspring were born in the water with traits that made it easier to swim, and why more offspring were born in the forest with traits that made it easier to climb. So at this point, if someone saw the animals and did not know about the volcano, they might think that the animals in the forest were not harpies. And it's true that they were beginning to look quite different. But the story does not end there, because this process of natural selection continued. And as time passed, the animals in the forest became even more different. And so, as time passed, there were more and more animals with the very skinniest tails, the very longest legs, and the very biggest claws, because those animals were the ones having more offspring. This cycle happened again and again over many years. That is the story of how Juramayas evolved from their harpy ancestors over many, many generations. That is the story that explains why harpies and Juramayas were related, even though they looked very different and were different species. To figure out where Juramayas came from, scientists had to use a lot of different evidence. They used what they knew about animals today and what they knew about Earth in the past. But the biggest clue was the fossils and the layers of rock they were buried in. By looking at all of the evidence, scientists can see that all animals on Earth are related. Fossils show us that all animals alive today are the descendants of other animals that were alive a long, long time ago.